Hello and welcome to Media MD, the podcast where each fortnight we prescribe each other a piece of media that we have somehow missed. I am Reuben Morehouse.
And I'm Elliot Debold.
And Elliot, it's your turn this fortnight.
Yes.
So what do you got?
I'm bringing you a novel, very classy, from the Discworld series. It's Guards, which I think is the 8th Discworld novel.
Surprise! You definitely didn't give me this book already in preparation for this episode.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just sort of start by introducing Discworld more than the individual book, and then I'll bury down into the book. So there's like well over 40 Discworld novels. Terry Pratchett was writing these things for like probably about 40 years, and it's basically. There's like many different sort of works in Discworld, and they're all like not quite related. Like that's why I can give you the 8th one, and because it barely has any characters that have appeared in the first 7. There's sort of many different storylines. So this is like what's known as the first one in the Night Watch series, and then there'll be other ones that'll include these characters. But then like the first 2 introduce like the Rincewind character. And then he'll pop up in other ones. So it's just sort of whatever Terry felt like writing about is sort of what he wrote about.
These are all nonsensical character names to me, Elliot.
Yeah.
Did you say there's a character called Choo Choo, the Night Wind or something?
Rincewind.
Rincewind. That's even weirder of a sounding name.
Yeah. But so really the only thing that sort of connects all the Discworld stories, aside from the setting, is essentially the themes of like parody and satire. So Terry like was a very funny writer, and so I sort of read a lot of these as a kid and then rediscovered the series a bit a few years ago when he passed away. And it's just he was just a funny guy. And that sort of really comes across in how well he points out sort of logical fallacies and stuff, and just sort of satirizes and parodies various things.
So is this like satirizing like common fantasy trope kind of deal?
Yeah, well, so different books sort of focus on different things, and this is actually part of why I had a lot of trouble sort of picking which book in the series to give you, because each one, or every series even, sort of focuses on parodying a different thing. So the Guards, which I've given you, sort of parodies a lot of like things like The Hobbit, so it does target like your classic fantasy tropes, but it also sort of does a bit of a take on like your police crime novel type thing.
All right.
And one of the other ones I considered giving you is called Small Gods, and it sort of is still in the fantasy setting, but it's really a sort of battle against organized religion, and he really sort of tackles the concept of organized religion. And so there's other ones. I mean, there's ones that are sort of rip-offs of Shakespeare, and he's parodying Shakespeare in those. So it again, like it's sort of really just whatever he felt like writing.
Yeah, so it's kind of like this setting.
Sort of fit it in.
This setting is just his playground for whatever he wants to kind of send up next. That's interesting.
And there's an official map of Discworld that was released a few years ago. But Terry Pratchett actually fought against that for ages because he never really wanted a map, because then he'd sort of actually have to adhere to it, and he'd sort of said like you can't map a sense of humor. Like so he didn't want a map for a while because he just always wanted to write whatever he felt like, and not having a map gave him the freedom to do that. But I guess eventually he caved.
I think I'm remembering one thing about Discworld. Is this, I don't know if it's the right thing, is this the one where like the number 8 is like a big thing?
Yeah, it is. So it's discussed mostly in the first book in the series. But yeah, so there's an 8th color of the rainbow in Discworld called Octarine.
Sure.
Which is the color of magic, which is the title of the first book. And then the 8th son of an 8th son is a wizard. There's lots of just, it's a world founded on just stupid crap that Terry wanted, which is great.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of like magic nonsense, which kind of makes me really excited to read it.
Yeah, and so I mean, like one of the important things about Discworld, I just sort of want to briefly introduce, because this is probably the only thing I'd say is useful to know going into Guards about the general world, is the concept of magic in Discworld. So there's obviously the sort of magic, like wizards cast spells and throw fireballs at each other.
Yeah.
But there's a deeper sort of it's described as like a basic force of the universe in Discworld is magic. So there's like gravity, electromagnetism, and like and magic.
And magic.
So there's like so Discworld has like a magical field around it, which is kind of like the magnetic field around Earth. And so some of the stuff about magic is just a really important part of it is the power of belief is what sort of shapes reality. So for instance, in Discworld, drop bears are real because everyone started believing in drop bears.
Wait, where was Terry Pratchett from?
He's British, but
Okay.
I guess the whole Australian drop bears thing must have reached him.
Must have tickled his fancy.
And so there's a similar thing. So for instance, if there's a witch and she's turned evil, chances are that witch will die in a house of gingerbread that she built because that's what evil witches do. They build gingerbread houses.
Right.
And similarly, there's this construct that often heroes will win because that's what people expect is going to happen and that sort of thing. And I guess it's just like an excuse for him to create all these hilariously tropey situations and then twist them somehow.
Yeah.
But similarly, so for instance, there's like a whole pantheon of gods that rule Discworld, but the gods are actually powered by belief from humans.
Belief, yeah.
Like, it's an interesting thing. So, there's a god for anything. Like, I think the example he uses in one of the books is if two snails cross over the same point, there's a god for that. But that god has no power unless people choose to believe and worship the god of the snail crossing.
Yeah.
And so, obviously it's this ironic thing where a lot of the most bloodthirsty and evil gods are the most powerful because people have seen them be bloodthirsty and believe in them and are terrified of them, but that's what gives them their power.
So what I really want to see now, and I'm sure he sounds like he's a guy who's kind of with it enough to write this, please tell me there is like campaigning, gods do like campaigning.
Yeah, well, and so that's the plot of Small Gods is essentially one of the gods who at one point was the most powerful materializes in the main part of Discworld to meet his 8th prophet and finds that all he has the power to do now is take the form of a turtle. Because it turns out that even though there's this whole organized religion, nobody there actually believes in him anymore. It's just become an institution that isn't about him. And there's only one lowly monk who actually believes in him. So him and the monk sort of have to set off on this campaign to make people believe in him again so he can get powerful again.
Now I want to read that one.
I mean, so that was the other one I sort of wanted to give you. But I settled on Guards because it's a bit more of a... like Small Gods deals a lot with organized religion and the nature of belief and all that, and that can get a bit heavy. Guards is just more fun. It's mostly a take on, I think it's meant to be a ripoff in a lot of ways of The Hobbit, with the added sort of crime procedural cop sort of thing integrated.
And fans of the podcast will know that I love police procedurals.
Yeah. So it's set in the city of Ankh-Morpork, which is
I feel like
the biggest city.
If we talk about this, I feel like we shouldn't talk about the plot at all because it's just all going to sound ridiculous and nonsensical. The best way to experience is just by experiencing it.
Yeah, I mean that's probably true. I'll just give you a super quick rundown of the characters. Just I won't even go that much into them, but
name as many ridiculous character and place names as you can, please.
Oh, okay. Well, so, like I said, it's set in Ankh-Morpork, which is the biggest city in Discworld. And it's, when you picture, like, a big city that's just full of, like, corrupt people who get in bar fights and everything, that's essentially what it is. Like, everyone there is just sort of corrupt and getting in bar fights, and it's just, like, sort of a miserable place that's sort of barely running. One of the first characters that's introduced is, okay, now I wrote this down. The Supreme Grand Master of the unique and supreme lodge of the elucidated brethren of the Ebon Knight, who is sort of the bad guy for most of the story. He's trying to summon a dragon to basically rule over Ankh-Morpork himself.
Okay.
And I guess so one of the things is dragons haven't really been in the Discworld series before this novel. And I remember reading somewhere that when Terry Pratchett set to write this one down, it was largely because he knew if he was going to keep writing a fantasy series, he'd have to address dragons at some point. So this book is largely just his take on how he can avoid having dragons in most of the Discworld books. Anyway, so then our main character is a guy called Carrot.
Jesus Christ. All right. No more names. I feel like you're going to spoil the names for me if you keep telling me them.
The one character I will mention then is someone who was introduced in previous books. He's one of the few characters who probably don't need knowledge of him from the previous books, but he does feature quite heavily in them. He's known as the Librarian, and he works as the Librarian in the Wizards University that's in Ankh-Morpork, and he's an orangutan.
Okay, yep.
Because there was an accident, so basically the library of Wizards University is obviously a very magical place, because there's so much magic in the books. So there was an accident that sort of turned him from a wizard into an orangutan. But he ended up staying that way because he liked it, because it made it easier to climb the shelves and put the books back. And so he features fairly heavily for part of the book. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, just sort of know that he was in the previous books, and if there's something unclear about his character or something, that's probably why.
Okie dokie. All right, I feel like the more you tell me about this, the more of the kind of ridiculousness is going to get spoiled. So I feel like I should just get into it and read it. I'm excited to read it. I think it sounds right up my alley.
So, we talked in the previous episode about the Adventure Zone, and I think the world reminds me a little bit of that in the sense that they're both sort of satirical fantasy worlds. So I think you can expect some similar jokes and everything. That's
great. That works for me. Problem is, if I like this book, I'm going to have to go out and read 40 other books.
Yeah, so even I usually, I think most of the things I've brought so far in this podcast are things that I've, read or watched everything that's sort of come out as part of it. Whereas I think I've only read 10 of the 40 Discworld books.
You are such a casual scrub.
Yeah, I know. And I want to read more. I honestly don't know why I haven't, because they're really good. So that's not a testament to their quality, but more just, I don't know, my incompetence.
All right. Well, yeah, I'll check it out, and we can meet back in a fortnight and see whether it was good or trash. I don't know. All right. Yeah, I'll pass us off to future Elliot and Reuben right now.
Thanks, past me. Yeah, so I'm here as usual to tell you that this next part of Media MD will contain spoilers for Guards, as well as 2 other Terry Pratchett books, Small Gods and Mort. So if you want to go into those unspoiled, then you should pause your podcasting device now. Otherwise, on with the show.
And we're back 2 weeks later. So, how do we start talking about Guards, Elliot? We'll get into a little plot summary, but... oh no, sorry.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm interested to see how you try and summarize the plot in a way that's short and makes sense.
Yeah, but first I just want to say the title of this episode is Guards, but I read Guards, and then I was like, that was pretty good, and that only took me 2 or 3 days. So then I read Small Gods, which you also gave me, and then I also read Mort, which you also gave me.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember I just gave you a big pile because I hadn't actually decided which one I was going to give you yet. I didn't mean to turn that into another 100 iZombie situation.
Yeah. But that's what it turned into. That's a little peek behind the scrubs. So Guards. I'm going to give you the plot summary. So it starts off talking about this character called Carrot. And he's a human raised by dwarfs, and then he's kind of so out of place in his dwarf society that his family decides to send him to the city of Ankh-Morpork to become a member of the Night Watch, who are essentially the policemen, although they're so not required in society anymore that they are completely functionless.
Well, yeah, so it used to be a respectable position, which I think Carrot's family's working off old information, so they think
100 years old information.
Yeah, but now because there is a great quote. The guy running Ankh-Morpork has basically made them useless because he legalized all of the crimes,
Yeah.
but just made them managed, because the idea is if he needed to drop, like, say, the rate of theft, rather than asking the police to do twice as much work, he could just ask the thieves to do less work.
Yeah, so there's like the Thieves Guild, which is like the institutionalized thieves, and the Assassins Guild and all that stuff. And so the Night Watch is completely pointless. And this leads to scenes where Carrot comes in with his like 100-year-old book of laws and starts like arresting the head of like the Assassins Guild and stuff. And everyone's just like, what is he doing? He's arresting the head assassin. Anyway, so the plot of the book kind of then becomes not really about Carrot at all, and kind of becomes about the leader of the Night Watch, whose name is, what is it?
Vimes.
Vimes.
Yeah.
A combination of Ving and Rames. Vimes. And he is like this drunk who runs the most useless group in the city, the Night Watch, and then he kind of eventually has to deal with this situation that no one else is really able to deal with, which is the summoning of a dragon. So we kind of half mentioned it. And so that's like my very brief plot summary. This guy summons a dragon, it attacks the city, it then kind of becomes the de facto leader of the city, and everyone just kind of worships the dragon for a bit, and then Vimes steps in, and some stuff happens, and the dragon isn't really killed, but it kind of just goes away. And that's the end of the book. But it's not like... If you go into this expecting like... You said that you thought it was... a play on The Hobbit in the first part, probably because there is like a dragon stuff, right?
Yeah.
But it's not, if you come into this expecting like a fantasy epic, you're obviously looking in the wrong place. Even I read the other two. I read Small Gods next and then Mort, and those were also quite kind of down to earth.
No,
Small Gods probably the least so, but...
Yeah, I'd say that like there are other ones like the first two, The Color of Magic and Light Fantastic. They're much more. It's about a wizard going on an adventure to save the planet type thing. Like that's a lot more that classic fantasy. And I mean, you know, those are the first two, so that's sort of, I guess, where it started.
Yeah, fair enough. And probably he kind of did that and then was like, don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But the real strength of Guards is in like the humor, right? So I'm going to read you the dedication of Guards right here, because this just sets the tone perfectly for the book.
So this is like the dedication at the start of the
book, yeah.
Yeah.
They may be called the Palace Guard, the City Guard, or the Patrol. Whatever the name, their purpose in any work of heroic fantasy is identical. It is, round about chapter 3, or 10 minutes into the film, to rush into the room, attack the hero one at a time, and be slaughtered. Nobody ever asked them if they wanted to. This book is dedicated to those fine men. And so it's like, it's obviously... Yeah, I think we kind of touched on it in the first part. The strength of these books is that they just fully embrace these tropes and embrace them to their natural conclusions, which is like go all the way down on them. So one other good example which comes up in Guards is everyone knows that if something has 1,000,000 to 1 chance, then it's going to succeed, right?
That was my favorite part of the book. Is this the part where they want to shoot the dragon down with an arrow, but they're worried that their marksman is too good, so it's not 1,000,000 to 1 chance. So they start making him do stuff like stand on one leg and put a bucket on his head. Yeah,
so because because when 1,000,000 to 1 chance always succeeds, everybody knows that. They have to like nerf him by like making him shoot with one hand, or like stand on his head and do all these crazy things to try and estimate what is exactly 1,000,000 to 1 chance. Because if they overshoot it, like no one has ever heard, oh, there's 1,000,000 and 1,000,000 to 1,010,000 chance, but it just might work. Like that's not a thing. So they have to try and nail the 1,000,000 to 1 chance exactly. Like that was a great sequence, just them trying to nerf their archer. And it's just these very like self-aware embracing of tropes, and I think that was its strength, is the way it kind of did that. Yeah, I'll talk about what I didn't like about the books as much, which is that I think they were. I did quite like them, obviously, because I read 3 of them.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Had to read 1, but I got this sense that like the jokes were pretty good, and the plot was all right, and the characters were pretty good, but it just kind of was a bit middling with the whole kind of. It didn't feel like the sum was as good as the parts to me. It felt like all the little individual bits were pretty good and there were funny scenes in isolation, but it didn't really flow together or feel like a cohesive kind of book as well as I would have liked it to.
Yeah, I know what you mean. We talked a bit about how, each book is just kind of whatever Terry probably felt like writing at that point. And it even feels a bit like that within each of the books. He just sort of writes whatever he's sort of feeling at that time, and it can stop it from feeling like a less rounded single story.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned this at the start with the plot summary, but the book kind of resolves with this dragon is like in charge, and he's like basically attacking the whole city, and it ends with another dragon that has kind of been existing throughout the story. This kind of small male dragon comes up to him, and they kind of fall in love and then fly away, and that's like the resolution of the plot.
Yeah,
and it's like it's like a good resolution. It's like a good little joke resolution, right?
Yeah,
but it kind of emphasizes to me how the stories never really feel like they make fun of the worst parts of these heroic fantasy stuff without taking on some of the good parts. Like, doesn't have like this resolution that feels like, okay, that tied the story together well. And even though I don't know, it feels like a weird criticism because obviously it's not meant to do that, but it's
I mean, I don't know, I'd actually probably disagree with that. Like, my memory of how it all ends is, the dragons fly off, and then the town or the city basically goes back to exactly the way it was, which was always sort of what was going to happen. And then the Night's Watch, are rewarded with everything they could possibly desire, which turns out to be not very much.
It's like a 5% pay raise.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know, I actually felt like it sort of, rounded out the story quite nicely. I think the story, like you said, meandered a bit. Like, it starts off being about Carrot, and then pivots to being about Vimes, and you can sort of see that Terry just decided that Vimes was more interesting and switched focus.
I think is accurate, but
yeah. But I think that was sort of the whole story sort of came together and finished in a nice way.
Yeah, that might not have been a good example. It just feels like it doesn't hit like the high. It does good comedy, but it doesn't ever hit the high notes with the story. And so it's just kind of like you're reading this book just to kind of see what jokes Terry is going to write next, and not to like enjoy the story of Carrot and Vimes or whatever, because it kind of gets really bogged down in that. Like, that stuff doesn't pull through enough.
You're saying the weakness is the actual story, more or less. Okay.
Yeah, even though I did quite like the 4 main characters in the book, who are like the Night Watch, and I guess the librarian, the orangutan that we mentioned in part 1, kind of comes in for a bit. But it's never like, I'm never reading this book to find out what's happening in the story or to get the resolution of the story. I was reading the book to kind of just see what the next good jokes that he was writing were, which I guess is okay, but it kind of feels like he's writing this book. If this book was a person, it's like intentionally crippling one of its limbs. And it's like, okay, you can still be a really good person without one of your limbs. This analogy is getting out of hand, but do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. I mean, like, I would agree that often these sort of overall plots aren't the strength of these books. It's definitely the individual like scenes and moments. But I guess I didn't think they were weak enough to get in the way. I see what you're saying. I think you're right. I wasn't really moving forward to find out what was happening next in that big plot. I was just sort of taking things as they came. But yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't consider that as much of a weakness.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think, and it wasn't like a huge weakness. I obviously still quite enjoyed the books, but I think it was too much of a weakness for me to not bring it up. It was enough to impact my enjoyment of the books, not enough to make me not enjoy the book.
Yeah, well, I guess so. One thing I wanted to bring up is like, so you may have noticed there aren't really chapters.
Yeah, I noticed. I was like, I'll just read a chapter before I go to bed.
Yeah.
I was just reading it for a while, and I was like, wait, what's happening?
I guess I was just interested because, like, I know that some people actually sort of, find that annoying because they like to do, like you said, read a chapter before bed and all that. But Terry Pratchett was actually avidly against chapters, so he never included them in any of his books. And I think some people actually don't like it, so I guess I was interested to see if that's something you have strong opinions on.
I would rather there were chapters, but it's not really a big not really a big deal. It just means I have to say it means I have to have self-control over when I stop, rather than just relying on Terry saying, stop now and go to sleep. But yeah, it was fine. I don't know. So I guess we should touch on Small Gods and Mort as well, because those I also read. Small Gods
has been... Oh, sorry, so I should clarify. Those are two that I haven't read recently, so you'll probably have to carry this more than usual.
Those two also seem quite consistent with what I was thinking about Guards. I mean, Small Gods and Mort are a bit more lofty, I suppose, in their kind of what they're trying to do, but they basically fall into the same... They have the same successes, and they fall into the same kind of traps. Where, like, Mort, for example, has this kind of thing that he's trying to stop, which is this convergence of these two realities, and they kind of resolve it, or they kind of half resolve it, and it kind of goes on in a similar way to Guards. And Small Gods actually I feel like, is a bit more of like an epic story, but also kind of feels like it falters in that story a bit. But I would say, from reading these three, they were obviously quite enjoyable, and I would want to read more, but it's not like...
Well, it's not a series where after you've read one or two, you feel like you want to straight away go and read the rest of the series. Well, yeah,
because they're not tied together as far as I can tell in many ways at all.
Also, the three you read weren't, but I think I touched on it. Like Guards is the first in the Night Watch series, and so I think there's like 5 or 6 more. So like book 13, I think, goes back to the Night Watch from Guards.
Does it go back to like Vimes?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so there's this great moment in one of the later ones where so there's the character Death who shows up in a lot of the books.
Mm-hmm.
And Vimes sort of has this... He almost gets killed in one of the later books, and Death shows up. And Vimes is like, am I having a near-death experience? And Death is just like really unimpressed, and he's like, yeah, I'm sick of having all these near-Vimes experiences as well.
Yeah, I think the character of Death is one that is quite interesting in these books, because Mort, the third book I read, is a story about this guy Mort who becomes Death's apprentice.
Yeah.
And so Death features... So I'll read you the blurb on the back. Death comes to us all. When he came to Mort, he offered him a job. and so Death is like this obviously heavily featured character who kind of throws around these like weird quips, but they're not quips. They're just like weird deathisms. I wouldn't really know how to describe them. There are a lot of characters in these books that are very interesting. He does write very interesting characters. I just feel like the story... And the characters are funny, and they're funny, and they're unique, and they kind of work well, not just on humorous levels, but as like fantasy or action heroes. But I just feel like his stories just kind of let them down, at least in the 3 books that I read.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, so let's talk about scores.
Yep.
I'm just going to give Guards a score, because that's the only one I really thought about beforehand. I think I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. We're going to go back to that old chestnut. I feel like they were very enjoyable, but I wouldn't ever want to read one just as the only thing that I'm reading, because I feel like it wouldn't sustain my, like, I don't know, something. This is very, I have a very, like, ennui kind of reaction to these books. I don't know, it's like, I liked them, but I didn't like them enough, and I'm trying to figure out why.
Okay.
That's my reaction. So that's summed up in a score to me. That would be a 7 out of 10.
Okay.
Anyway, I do think I'll read The Colour of Magic, which is the last one that you gave me that I haven't read yet.
Okay.
I guess this one will tackle a more
well, this was the first one
focused thing.
So it's more of a straight up fantasy.
Yeah. Anyway, 7 out of 10. That's my rating. Love it or hate it. You know. Yeah.
Okay.
Alright.
Strong finish.
So that wraps up another episode of Media MD. Next fortnight we'll be checking out a book called The Painted Man, or The Watered Man if you're in the US. So be sure to buy that, pick that up, read it, and come back in 2 weeks to talk about it. If you want to talk about this episode or discuss The Watered Man while you're reading it with our community, you can go to our website. We have links to our Facebook, Twitter, and our subreddit where you can discuss stuff with us and people and stuff. Yeah, it's fun. Check it out. The website's at mediamdpodcast.com. So check that out, or we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.